My name is Jennifer, and for 27 years, I believe that the truest parts of myself were my greatest flaws. I was the family's black sheep, the one labeled too dramatic simply because I refused to stay silent when things weren't right, and I cared too much to pretend. Welcome to Mother's Story. Before we unfold this chapter of my life, I want to take a quiet moment to humbly thank you for being here. In a world that is always rushing, the fact that you have chosen to pause, sit down, and share your valuable time with me today means more than words can express. I am so deeply grateful for your presence. If you have ever been made to feel like you had to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's perfect picture, if you have ever been left out, misunderstood, or told that your emotions are simply too much, please know that you are not alone. This story is for you. I want to remind you today that you do not need to change your soul to be loved. The very qualities that others might call a liability are often your greatest superpowers. Sometimes the rejection that breaks our hearts is actually life's beautiful, painful way of pushing us exactly where we are meant to be. If this journey touches your heart, or if you find a piece of your own reflection in these words, I warmly invite you to subscribe to Mother's Story. By joining this channel, you are helping us build a safe, loving community where authenticity is always celebrated, and where no one ever has to hide who they truly are. So take a deep breath, settle in, and let's begin. The morning light in Portland has a specific way of filtering through the gray clouds, a muted silver glow that usually makes my kitchen feel like a sanctuary. I was leaning against the counter, the warmth of my ceramic mug seeping into my palms, thinking about the upcoming weekend. I had already looked at flights to Napa. I'd even bookmarked a dress that felt sophisticated but not stifling. Then the front door clicked, and the sanctuary was breached. My mother didn't knock, she never does. And as she stepped into the kitchen, the air seemed to tighten. She was wearing a trench coat that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her hair perfectly coiffed despite the Oregon drizzle. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask how my week at the marketing firm was going. She simply stood there, crossing her arms over her chest, and looked at me with an expression that was halfway between pity and a chore she was dreading. "You're too dramatic for a classy event like this, Jennifer," she said. The words weren't shouted. They were delivered with that familiar, soft condescension that acts like a silencer on a gun. It was the kind of tone she used when I was 10 and wore mismatched socks, or when I was 20 and decided to major in communications instead of pre-law. "Your cousin Stephanie's wedding is going to be elegant. It's going to be sophisticated. It's a destination event at a very exclusive vineyard in Napa Valley, and frankly, we've all discussed it. We can't have you causing a scene." I set my coffee cup down on the granite counter with a slow, deliberate click. I could feel the heat rising in my neck, that prickly sensation of being trapped in a narrative I didn't write. "Discussed it," I repeated, my voice remarkably steady despite the roar in my ears. "The whole family sat down and decided that I'm a liability? It's nothing personal, dear," she said, shifting uncomfortably but not backing down. She began to pace the small length of my kitchen, her eyes darting toward the sink as if checking for unwashed dishes to criticize. "Stephanie specifically requested a drama-free celebration. She's worked very hard on this. It's being featured in a major wedding magazine, for heaven's sake. And you know how you can be. When you get worked up about things, it becomes a lot. For everyone." There it was. How I can be. In the lexicon of my family, dramatic was the code word for honest. I thought back to last Christmas, the memory vivid and bitter. We were sitting around a table that groaned under the weight of expensive china and silver, and my Uncle Dave had started in on a rant about certain people moving into his neighborhood. He'd used words that made the air feel dirty. My cousins had stared at their plates. My mother had shifted a centerpiece. But I had looked him in the eye and told him his comments were racist and unacceptable. In that moment, I wasn't the person with a moral compass. I was the dramatic one who ruined the holiday spirit. Then there was the time cousin Maya was getting dragged through the mud in the family group chat because of her divorce. They were calling her weak, gossiping about her husband's needs, and acting as though she had failed the family brand. I had stepped in, typed out a 3-paragraph defense of her autonomy, and told everyone to mind their own business. The result? Maya was still the fallen woman, and I was the troublemaker who couldn't let things go. "So," I said, leaning back against the fridge, "everyone is going. Aunt Helen, Uncle Dave, the twins, even Maya. Everyone except me." It's for the best, Jennifer, my mother insisted, her voice gaining a frantic edge of excitement as she moved past the awkwardness of the rejection. It's a 3-day affair. Welcome drinks on the terrace, a sunrise yoga session, the ceremony at the peak of the vineyard, and a reception that's supposed to go until dawn. Stephanie and her fiancé, he's in tech, very successful, have curated every single second. It's about the aesthetic. It's about the perfection of the moment. I watched her face light up as she described an event I was officially banned from. It was a masterclass in erasure. To them, I wasn't a daughter or a niece. I was a smudge on a lens. I was the one person who might look at the perfect husband and the perfect vineyard and ask a question that wasn't in the script. I was the variable they couldn't control, and in a world where everything is designed for maximum social media impact, an uncontrolled variable is a nightmare. I wish them the best, I said. My mother stopped mid-sentence, her mouth slightly open. She had been bracing for the drama. She expected me to cry, to point out the unfairness, to perhaps bring up the racist uncle again or the hypocrisy of a family wedding that excludes family. She wanted me to explode so she could walk away feeling justified. She wanted to be able to tell Aunt Helen, "See? I told you she was unstable. It's a good thing we didn't invite her." You're not upset?" she asked, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Why would I be upset?" I asked, picking up my phone and casually scrolling through my calendar, as if I were looking for a conflict I'd forgotten. "You've made it very clear that my presence would somehow tarnish the event. I respect Stephanie's wishes for her special day. If my existence is a threat to her aesthetic, then staying home is the most classy thing I can do, right?" "Well," she stammered, clearly thrown by the lack of ammunition. "I'm glad you're being so mature about this. Truly. It shows growth, Jennifer. I'll tell the others you were very understanding." She lingered for a few more minutes, fidgeting with her silk scarf, waiting for the other shoe to drop. She wanted a scene. She needed a scene to tell the story she had already written about me. But I didn't give it to her. I smiled. A polite, professional smile I usually reserved for clients who asked for impossible revisions, and waited for her to leave. When the door finally shut behind her, the silence of the apartment rushed back in, but it didn't feel like a sanctuary anymore. Felt like a cage. I sank onto the couch, the professional indifference evaporating instantly. My heart was pounding, a dull ache forming behind my eyes. It wasn't just about a wedding. It was about the realization that my family saw me as something to be managed. They had held meetings about me. They had sent out invitations, booked hotel blocks, and coordinated outfits, all while keeping a secret from me. They had lived their lives in a flurry of excitement, and I was the only person who was left in the dark until it was too late to argue. I work as a social media manager. My entire professional life is dedicated to understanding how people perceive truth versus performance. I know how to craft a narrative. I know how to make a brand look untouchable. And sitting there, I realized that my family was just another brand. They were the Andersons, a collection of people who valued the appearance of goodness over the actual practice of it. Stephanie wasn't marrying a man. She was marrying an image. And my mother wasn't protecting a wedding. She was protecting a lie. I pulled up Instagram and searched for Stephanie's profile. It was exactly what I expected. A curated wasteland of beige tones, expensive linens, and engagement photos where her fiancé looked more like a prop than a person. The wedding hashtag was already there, tucked neatly into her bio. Everything was prepared for the magazine spread. Everything was set for the perfect story. They thought I was dramatic. They thought I would cause a scene. As I stared at the screen, a new feeling started to stir beneath the hurt. A cold, sharp clarity. If they wanted drama, they were looking in the wrong place. They thought I was a fire they had successfully extinguished, but they didn't realize that by excluding me, they had removed the only thing that kept me playing by their rules, the desire to belong. I wasn't the daughter they wanted, and I certainly wasn't the guest Stephanie wanted. But I was a social media manager who knew exactly how to capture the attention of a digital audience. They wanted a perfect, curated, quiet weekend where I didn't exist. But they forgot that in the world of modern storytelling, the most powerful thing isn't the person who is invited to the party. It's the person who knows how to tell the story from the outside. The digital avalanche started on Tuesday morning. My phone, sitting innocently beside my laptop on my desk, began to vibrate with the kind of frantic, rhythmic intensity that usually signals an emergency. It wasn't an emergency. It was the Anderson Family Updates group chat, a digital space I had somehow not been formally evicted from, likely because my mother and aunts wanted to maintain the illusion of familial inclusion, even while actively orchestrating my exile. I watched the screen light up, notification after notification stacking like bricks in a wall built entirely to keep me out. Aunt Helen was complaining about the lack of first-class upgrades on her flight out of LAX. Maya, whom I had defended just months prior, was agonizing over whether her seafoam green bridesmaid dress clashed with the specific golden hour lighting the photographer had promised. Uncle Dave was demanding to know if the Napa Valley golf course had appropriately rigid dress codes. They were discussing welcome bags, custom monogrammed cocktail napkins, and the exact vintage of the champagne being served at the rehearsal dinner. Every ping was a reminder of the velvet rope that had been unceremoniously dropped across my path. I picked up the phone, my thumb hovering over the Leave Group button. It would be so easy. One tap and the digital noise would stop. But a masochistic part of me couldn't do it. Leaving the chat would be a dramatic exit, and hadn't my mother just accused me of being too dramatic? So I compromised. I muted the thread. But muting doesn't stop the messages from arriving. It just silences their entry. I still knew they were there, accumulating in the background, a relentless ledger of a celebration I wasn't good enough to attend. I closed my laptop and moved to the living room of my Portland apartment. Outside, the classic Pacific Northwest drizzle was painting the windows with streaks of gray and silver. It was the kind of weather that practically begged you to stay inside, wrap yourself in a heavy knit blanket, and surrender to melancholy. I sank into my olive green velvet sofa, pulling my knees to my chest, and let the silence of the room wash over me. This is when the spiraling truly began. I started to dive deep into the psychology of being erased. It's a very specific kind of pain. It isn't the sharp, hot sting of a screaming argument or the definitive closure of a burned bridge. Erasure is insidious. It's a slow fade. My family wasn't explicitly telling me they hated me. They were just quietly rearranging the furniture of our shared history, so that there was no longer a chair for me to sit in. By labeling me too dramatic, they had found a convenient, socially acceptable loophole to justify my exclusion. They had pathologized my honesty. If I was the crazy one, the unstable one, the liability, then they were the victims who simply had to protect the sanctity of Cousin Stephanie's glossy, magazine-ready aesthetic. In my line of work as a social media manager, I deal with curation every single day. I know how to edit a photo to remove a stray piece of trash in the background. I know how to crop out the ugly industrial building next to the boutique hotel. I know how to construct an airtight narrative of perfection. Sitting there in the quiet of my living room, I realized with sickening clarity that I was the stray piece of trash. I was the ugly building. I was the blemish on the Anderson family's carefully curated grid. And they had just applied a massive collective crop. The weight of it pressed down on my chest. I thought about all the family holidays I had endured, biting my tongue until I tasted copper, trying to be small and agreeable just to keep the peace. I thought about the gifts I had bought, the flights I had booked, the emotional labor I had expended trying to bridge the gap between who I actually was and who they needed me to be. And for what? So my mother could stand in my kitchen and tell me I was an embarrassment? The temptation to wallow was a physical pull. I wanted to order a massive amount of takeout, turn off my phone, and spend the entire weekend crying into a bowl of noodles, grieving the family I deserved but clearly did not have. Just as I was mentally preparing to surrender to the spiral, my phone rang. It wasn't a ping from the muted family chat. It was a loud, obnoxious pop song I had assigned as a custom ringtone years ago. I glanced at the screen. It was Chloe. Chloe is my best friend, a top-tier wedding photographer whose schedule is usually booked out 2 years in advance. She is everything my family is not. Loud, fiercely loyal, beautifully messy, and violently authentic. She doesn't know how to curate her personality, and her photography reflects that. Raw, emotional, breathtakingly real. I cleared my throat, trying to shake the melancholy from my vocal cords, and answered, "Hey, to what do I owe the pleasure on a Tuesday afternoon?" "Jen. Thank God you picked up." Chloe's voice came rushing through the speaker, breathless and buzzing with a frantic electric energy. "I need you. Are you sitting down?" Tell me you're sitting down. I am currently merging with my sofa, yes. What's going on? Are you okay? I'm more than okay. I'm vibrating on a different frequency right now, she practically shouted. Listen to me. I just got a call an hour ago. A massive last-minute booking for this Saturday. And when I say massive, I mean unlimited budget, absolute dream scenario. This Saturday? I sat up slightly, the fog of my pity party beginning to thin. Chloe, it's Tuesday. Who plans an unlimited budget wedding in 4 days? A couple who just had a massive cancellation with their original photographer and decided to pivot the whole vibe, Chloe explained rapidly. The bride is Jasmine, she's this incredible influencer, but the anti-influencer kind, you know? And the groom Oliver owns some tech startup. They're getting married at Multnomah Falls. They rented out the entire historic lodge. They want the ceremony right by the waterfall at golden hour. Multnomah Falls? That's gorgeous, I said, genuinely happy for her despite the lead sitting in my stomach. That's going to be incredible for your portfolio. Not just mine, Jen, Chloe said, dropping her voice to a serious, conspiratorial register. Ours. I need you to come with me. I blinked at the rain hitting the window. Chloe, I love you, but I don't know the first thing about ISOs, apertures, or whatever magic you do with your lenses. I'd be useless as a second shooter. I don't need a second shooter. I have my assistant for the technical stuff, she said impatiently. I need you. I need a social media strategist. Jasmine and Oliver specifically said they want to capture the raw behind-the-scenes magic. They want to launch a joint business venture off the back of this. And they need immediate, high-impact, shareable content. They don't just want a wedding album in 6 months. They want the story told in real time. They want authenticity to go viral. The word hung in the air. Authenticity. While my family was marching toward a sterilized, highly produced pantomime of love in Napa Valley, an event from which I had been explicitly barred for being too real, here was an opportunity to document the exact opposite. Multnomah Falls was wild, natural and roaring. It couldn't be controlled or sanitized. I know what happened with your mom, Chloe continued softly, her tone shifting from frantic professional to fiercely protective best friend. I know they exiled you from Stephanie's Plastic Country Club coronation. You could sit in your apartment all weekend and let them make you feel like you don't matter. Or you can come with me, get paid a ridiculous day rate, and do what you do best. Tell a better story. I stood up from the sofa. The blanket fell to the floor, and for the first time in 48 hours I didn't feel the crushing weight of erasure. I felt a spark. It was dangerous, thrilling, and deeply validating. My mother had told me I was too dramatic to be trusted at a classy event. She thought my lack of an invitation would silence me. What time do we need to be at the lodge on Saturday? I asked, walking over to my desk and opening my laptop. 10 in the morning, Chloe shrieked, the excitement returning full force. We have full creative control, Jen. We are going to make art. Send me the couple's current social handles and whatever mood board they gave you, I said, pulling up a fresh strategy document. If they want the story told in real time, we need a hashtag, a narrative arc, and a shot list that prioritizes emotion over aesthetics. You're in. Oh, I'm in, I said, a slow smile finally breaking across my face. Napa Valley is going to be so boring this weekend anyway. I hung up the phone and looked out the window. The rain was still falling, but the gray didn't look so bleak anymore. My family had spent my whole life trying to edit me out of their picture. It was finally time for me to pick up the camera and show them exactly what they were missing. The moment the call with Chloe ended, the atmosphere in my apartment shifted completely. The oppressive damp gray of the Portland afternoon felt less like a prison sentence and more like a blank canvas. I didn't just feel awake. I felt weaponized. I grabbed my coat and an umbrella, leaving my pity party on the living room floor, and headed straight for the Pearl District. Chloe and I had agreed to meet at our usual spot, a dimly lit, cozy wine bar with exposed brick walls and a bartender who knew our orders by heart. When I arrived, Chloe was already seated at a corner booth, her laptop open, radiating a chaotic, brilliant energy that I had desperately needed. She had 2 glasses of Pinot Noir waiting and a manic grin on her face. Before I could even shrug off my wet coat, she spun her laptop around to face me. Meet Jasmine and Oliver, she said, tapping the screen with a dark-painted fingernail. I leaned in, studying the images on the screen. There were no highly stylized engagement photos. There were no matching beige outfits standing rigidly in a manicured field. Instead, I saw a candid shot of a woman with an incredible, unrestrained laugh, her hair whipped across her face by the wind, looking at a man whose eyes held nothing but pure, unadulterated adoration for her. They were sitting on the hood of a dusty Subaru. It was messy. It was real. It was magnetic. "Okay, I'm listening," I said, sliding into the booth and taking a sip of the wine. "Give me the full rundown." "They are the anti-bridezilla and anti-groomzilla," Chloe explained, her eyes wide with excitement. "Jasmine has a solid following online, but she's totally pivoting away from the polished influencer aesthetic. She wants to use her platform to talk about realistic expectations, mental health, and authentic relationships. Oliver owns a mid-sized tech company. He has money, Jen. Like serious money. They could have easily thrown a six-figure spectacle if they wanted to. But they chose not to. Why? I asked, genuinely fascinated. In my family, having money meant you were obligated to spend it in a way that ensured everyone else knew exactly how much you had. Because they realized they were spending more time talking about getting married than actually being engaged, Chloe said, leaning over the table. They met through mutual friends, fell madly in love, and got engaged after 6 months. When they started planning the wedding, they realized the wedding industry was trying to turn their relationship into a performance. So they pulled the plug. They planned this entire Multnomah Falls elopement-style wedding in 6 weeks. No massive bridal party. No elaborate seating charts. Just a handful of people who genuinely loved them, standing next to a waterfall. The irony was so sharp it almost cut me. While my cousin Stephanie and my mother were currently agonizing over the exact Pantone shade of the dinner napkins and barring family members who might ruin the vibe, Jasmine and Oliver were stripping everything down to the studs. They were choosing the marriage over the wedding. They specifically told me they want my creative vision to shine, Chloe continued. They want the raw moments. The messy tears. The wind messing up her hair. But they also want it documented for social media in real time. They want to show people that love doesn't have to be an expensive, stressful theatrical production to be valid. That's where you come in, Jen. I can shoot the high-resolution art, but I need you to capture the pulse of the day. The behind-the-scenes magic. I need your eye for what makes a story resonate online. I stared at the photos of Jasmine and Oliver, my mind already racing 10 steps ahead. In my day job as a social media manager, my goal is always to find the emotional hook. People scroll past perfection because perfection is alienating. It makes you feel bad about your own life. But vulnerability, authenticity, that stops people in their tracks. It builds community. It makes people feel seen. I opened my own laptop and created a new document. I didn't even hesitate before typing the title at the top of the page. The Anti-Napa Strategy. Here's what we do, I said, the words flowing out of me with a fierce, undeniable momentum. We don't post a single post shot on the day of the wedding. Not one. If they want to inspire people, we give the audience a backstage pass to real love. We shoot short, vertical videos of the quiet moments, Jasmine breathing before she walks down the aisle, Oliver's hands shaking as he reads his vows. We use natural lighting. No heavy filters. We craft captions that feel like journal entries, not press releases. Chloe was practically vibrating. Yes, exactly. I want the gallery to feel like you're inside their hearts, not looking at them through a display window. My family is spending hundreds of thousands of dollars this weekend to create an event that looks good in a magazine, I said, my voice dropping to a low, determined register. They exiled me because they thought my presence would disrupt their perfect illusion. But they don't understand how the internet works anymore. The era of the glossy, untouchable mega-wedding is dying. People are starved for reality. We are going to give them reality. The rest of the evening blurred into a frantic, joyful strategy session. I researched trending audio that leaned acoustic and emotional. I mapped out a timeline for Instagram stories and reels, ensuring we built a narrative arc that started with the calm morning preparations and crescendoed with the raw power of the waterfall ceremony. I wasn't just planning a social media rollout. I was building a counter-narrative. The dangerous spark of inspiration that had ignited in my apartment was now a full-blown fire. I was channeling every ounce of hurt, rejection, and frustration from my family's betrayal into this project. I was going to prove that the very qualities my family despised in me, my bluntness, my insistence on the truth, my refusal to play pretend, were actually my greatest assets. The true test of my new armor came on Thursday evening, 2 days before the wedding. I was in my apartment packing a sleek black tote bag with portable chargers, a gimbal, and a backup hard drive when my phone rang. The caller ID flashed. Aunt Helen, Stephanie's mother, the architect of the Napa Valley guest list. I took a deep breath, letting the steady confidence of the anti-Napa strategy anchor me, and swiped to answer. Hi, Aunt Helen. Jennifer, honey. Her voice rang out, dripping with a thick syrup of fake sympathy that immediately set my teeth on edge. I just wanted to call and check on you. I heard about the situation with the wedding guest list. It's fine, Aunt Helen. I know the venue had strict constraints. I lied smoothly, my tone light and unbothered. Well, I just want you to know that it wasn't personal, she continued, the lie rolling off her tongue with practiced ease. Stephanie just wants everything to be absolutely perfect. And you know how sensitive you can be about family things. We just didn't want you to feel overwhelmed. Sensitive. Right. Another word for dramatic. Just dressed up in a softer cardigan to sound nicer. They were trying to gaslight me into believing that my exclusion was an act of mercy for my own mental health. I understand completely, I said, staring at the timeline I had printed out for Jasmine and Oliver's wedding. I hope Stephanie has a beautiful day. I'm sure the photos will be lovely. There was a brief, confused pause on the line. Aunt Helen had clearly called expecting to sue the hysterical, bitter niece. My complete lack of resistance was throwing off her script. You're being so mature about this. I have to say, Jennifer, I'm proud of how you're handling it. Maybe this will be a good learning experience for you about how to be more flexible when it comes to family expectations. I bit the inside of my cheek hard enough to taste copper. Flexible. Read compliant. Silent. Invisible. Actually, I said, keeping my voice bright and breezy, giving her absolutely zero ammunition to use against me. It worked out for the best. I'm actually working this weekend anyway. A massive professional development opportunity came up that I couldn't turn down. Working on a Saturday? Aunt Helen asked, her tone shifting from fake sympathy to mild distaste. Well, I suppose keeping busy is a good way to distract yourself. Exactly, I smiled, even though she couldn't see it. Have a wonderful time in Napa, Aunt Helen. Send everyone my love. I hung up the phone and tossed it onto the sofa. As I looked down at my meticulously packed gear bag, I realized a profound shift had occurred within me over the last 48 hours. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't nursing a bruised ego or wishing I could magically transform into the quiet, compliant cousin they wanted me to be. I was focused. I was energized. My family had built a beautiful, expensive stage in California, and they had locked me out of the theater. But what they didn't realize was that I had just been handed the keys to a different kind of stage altogether. One with an infinitely larger audience, and a story that actually mattered. I zipped up my bag, double-checked my equipment, and went to sleep feeling more purposeful than I had in years. Saturday was coming, and I was more than ready for the golden hour. Saturday morning dawned with that specific, crisp Pacific Northwest clarity that only arrives after days of relentless, heavy rain. The sky was a brilliant, bruised blue, and the air pouring through my cracked bedroom window tasted like pine needles and cold river water. I woke up 10 minutes before my alarm was set to go off, my eyes snapping open not with the usual groggy reluctance of the weekend, but with a sharp electric jolt of purpose. Today was the day. Today I was going to war, armed with nothing but a smartphone, a gimbal, and a desperate need to prove that reality is infinitely more compelling than a stage play. Before I even tossed the duvet off my legs, muscle memory had me reaching for my phone on the nightstand. I unlocked the screen and there it was, the digital assault. The top of my Instagram feed was a continuous glowing row of colorful circles, all belonging to my extended family. I tapped on Cousin Maya's icon first, bracing myself for the curated perfection I knew was waiting. It was a masterclass in performative wealth. The first story was a boomerang of Maya and 3 other cousins clinking crystal champagne flutes on a sun-drenched balcony in Napa Valley. They were all wearing matching monogrammed blush pink silk robes that looked incredibly uncomfortable. But it wasn't the clothes that caught my attention, it was their faces. Their smiles were stretched tight, their eyes vacant and slightly frantic, constantly darting off camera as if waiting for a director to yell cut. I tapped to the next slide. It was a pan across the venue's ballroom where the reception would be held later that night. Aunt Helen's voice could be heard in the background, sharp and shrill, complaining that the table linens were eggshell instead of ivory. The floral arrangements were massive, towering monoliths of white orchids and pale, bloodless roses. They were undeniably expensive, but they looked entirely devoid of life. It didn't look like a room preparing to celebrate the messy, vibrant union of two human beings. It looked like a very chic, very expensive funeral for someone nobody actually liked. I kept tapping through the updates, watching my family construct their impenetrable fortress of status. There were close-ups of diamond tennis bracelets, slow-motion walks down the vineyard paths, and a heavily filtered selfie of Stephanie looking terrified behind a mask of professional makeup. Every single post was tagged with hashtag Stephanie and marked on it, a hashtag that felt as rigid and uninspired as the event itself. I felt a sudden profound wave of relief wash over me. For the first time since my mother had stood in my kitchen and banished me from the kingdom, I was genuinely deeply glad I wasn't there. The air in those photos looked too thin to breathe. I threw my legs over the side of the bed and got to work. I dressed for utility rather than aesthetics. Black high-waisted trousers that allowed me to crouch and move, a comfortable black turtleneck, and my most reliable boots. When Chloe honked from the street below at exactly 9:30, I practically flew down the stairs of my apartment building, my gear bag slung securely across my chest. "Ready to make some art?" Chloe asked as I slid into the passenger seat of her SUV, which was currently acting as a mobile command center filled with lenses, light reflectors, and half-empty coffee cups. "I have never been more ready for anything in my entire life," I said, buckling my seatbelt. "I've done the morning opposition research. Napa is currently drowning in eggshell linens and suppressed anxiety. The bar for genuine emotion is literally on the floor." The drive out to the Columbia River Gorge gave us time to run through our strategy one final time. As we left the concrete constraints of Portland behind, the landscape opened up into towering cliffs of dark basalt and dense, ancient forests of Douglas fir. The winding highway hugged the edge of the river, and with every mile we drove, the knot of tension that had been living between my shoulder blades since Tuesday began to loosen. By the time the iconic, cascading ribbon of Multnomah Falls came into view, rushing over the mossy cliffs with a deafening, magnificent roar, I felt completely untethered from my family's expectations. We parked and made our way to the historic Multnomah Falls Lodge, a beautiful rustic stone building nestled right at the base of the waterfall. I expected the usual pre-wedding chaos. Frantic coordinators wielding clipboards, bridesmaids arguing over eyelash glue, a bride hyperventilating in a corner. But as Chloe pushed open the heavy wooden door to the suite Jasmine had rented for the morning, the atmosphere hit me like a physical wave of calm. There was no screaming. There was no tension. There was just music, a soft, acoustic indie playlist drifting from a portable speaker, and the smell of fresh coffee and damp pine coming from the open balcony window. Jasmine was sitting cross-legged in the middle of a plush rug, wearing a simple oversized flannel shirt. She wasn't surrounded by a glam squad. Her sister was sitting behind her, gently braiding her dark hair, while her best friend sat on the sofa, telling a story that had Jasmine laughing so hard she was practically folded in half. It was a deep belly laugh, the kind that wrinkles your nose and makes your eyes water. "You must be Jennifer," Jasmine gasped, wiping a tear of mirth from her eye as she looked up and saw us standing in the doorway. She scrambled to her feet and pulled me into a warm, immediate hug. "Chloe told me you were coming to save the day with the social media content. I cannot tell you how grateful Oliver and I are." "Thank you for having me," I said, instantly charmed by her radiant, unguarded energy. There was zero pretense here. "Your vision for today is incredible. I'm just here to make sure the rest of the world gets to see how beautiful this approach to a wedding can be." "That's exactly what we want," Jasmine said, walking over to a small table to pour me a cup of coffee. We spent so much time at the beginning of our engagement stressing over centerpieces and guest lists, trying to please people who didn't even really know us. Finally, Oliver just looked at me one night and said, "Are we throwing a party for them?" Or are we making a promise to each other? That was it. We canceled the circus and booked the waterfall. The irony was not lost on me. Here was a woman who possessed the exact kind of wealth and social capital my family worshipped, and she had actively chosen to walk away from the spectacle they were currently killing themselves to maintain in California. She chose authenticity. My family chose the magazine spread. I pulled my phone from my pocket, attached it to my handheld gimbal, and faded into the background. My job wasn't to direct, it was to document. I started rolling as Jasmine's sister carefully pinned a simple, delicate floral comb into Jasmine's braid. I captured the soft morning light illuminating the dust motes in the air around them. I filmed the moment Jasmine's best friend handed her a handwritten letter from Oliver, capturing the exact second Jasmine's relaxed smile morphed into a trembling, profound expression of love as she read his words. A single tear tracked down her cheek, and she didn't rush to dab it away with a tissue to save her makeup. She just let it fall, her hand coming up to rest over her heart. I watched the footage back on my screen, my breath hitching slightly. It was breathtaking. The colors were warm and earthy, the emotion was palpable, and the narrative was undeniably real. Money could buy 1,000 ghost orchids. It could buy exclusive vineyard views and custom blush pink robes. But it could not buy the sacred, quiet intimacy unfolding in this lodge. I opened Instagram, created the first reel of the day, and layered the footage of Jasmine reading the letter over a soft, acoustic audio track. I didn't use a flashy filter. I didn't write a long, boastful caption. I simply wrote, "The quiet moments before forever." When you strip away the expectations, what's left is just love. I hit publish. As the upload progress bar filled, I looked out the window at the roaring waterfall, feeling a fierce protective pride swelling in my chest. While my cousins were busy posing for a life they were merely pretending to live, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Standing in the middle of the truth, ready to show the world exactly what real magic looked like. By 1:30 in the afternoon, the sun had begun its slow, golden descent toward the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the Columbia River Gorge. The air had cooled slightly, carrying with it the sharp, clean scent of crushed pine needles and the damp, earthy perfume of the moss that clung to the basalt cliffs. We moved from the quiet sanctuary of the lodge down to the base of Multnomah Falls, the roar of the cascading water growing louder and more magnificent with every step. There was no red carpet. There were no velvet ropes or rigidly aligned rows of uncomfortable wooden folding chairs. Instead, nature had provided the perfect amphitheater. A natural stone viewing area enclosed by ancient, towering trees and bathed in the mist of the two-tiered waterfall plunging hundreds of feet into the pool below. The guest list was astonishingly small. There were perhaps 20 people gathered near the stone bridge, standing in a loose, comfortable semicircle. They were dressed warmly and beautifully, but without the stiff, performative pageantry that dictated my family's social gatherings. There were no matching bridesmaid dresses, no synchronized groomsmen, and absolutely no coordinators barking orders through a headset. It was just a group of people who genuinely loved Jasmine and Oliver, chatting softly, their voices mingling with the endless rush of the water. I positioned myself near the front edge of the group, my gimbal stabilized and my phone fully charged, while Chloe moved with athletic grace around the perimeter, adjusting her heavy lenses to capture the sweeping, high-resolution majesty of the landscape. Then Oliver arrived. He stepped out from the pathway leading from the lodge, and my camera instinctively gravitated toward him. He wasn't wearing a stiff, suffocating tuxedo. He wore a beautifully tailored dark forest green suit that mirrored the towering pines around him, paired with a simple open-collared shirt. But it wasn't his clothes that drew the eye, it was his sheer, unfiltered humanity. He looked terrified in the most beautiful way possible. His hands were clasped in front of him, his knuckles white, and his chest rose and fell with rapid, shallow breaths. He was vibrating with a nervous energy that had nothing to do with the logistics of an event, and everything to do with the magnitude of the promise he was about to make. I zoomed in slightly, framing his face against the blurred backdrop of the falling water. In the viewfinder, I watched him close his eyes, take a deep, trembling breath, and swipe a nervous hand across his jaw. He wasn't trying to look cool. He wasn't trying to strike a pose for the cameras. He was simply a man standing at the edge of his old life, entirely overwhelmed by the prospect of his new one. A sudden hush fell over the small crowd. The ambient chatter faded, replaced entirely by the sound of the waterfall and the sudden, sweet notes of an acoustic guitar. A friend of the couple had stepped forward, strumming a slow, stripped-down version of a song I recognized, an old indie folk ballad that spoke of enduring love rather than fleeting romance. There was no grand announcement. There was no "Here Comes the Bride," echoing awkwardly from hidden speakers. There was just the music, the water, and then Jasmine. She rounded the bend of the stone pathway, her sister walking a few paces behind her to hold the train of her dress away from the damp earth. The wind caught the lightweight fabric of her gown, making it billow and float around her like a cloud. She looked ethereal but deeply grounded. Her smile was so wide, so radiant, that it seemed to generate its own light. I kept the camera focused on Oliver. As Jasmine came into his line of sight, the tension in his shoulders instantly evaporated, only to be replaced by something so profoundly moving that it caught in my own throat. I watched through the screen of my phone as Oliver's breath hitched. His eyes widened, completely unshielded, and a single tear spilled over his lashes, tracking quickly down his cheek. He let out a breathless, watery laugh, raising a hand to his mouth as if he couldn't quite contain the sheer magnitude of his joy. He looked at her as if she were the only fixed point in a spinning universe. He looked at her like she was an absolute miracle. My thumb hovered over the record button, keeping the shot steady, but my mind was spinning violently. A strange, heavy ache bloomed in the center of my chest. I realized, with a sudden and devastating clarity, that I had never seen that look on the face of anyone in my family. I thought about my parents' marriage, a polite, sterile partnership built on shared real estate investments and a mutual desire to maintain appearances. I thought about my Uncle Dave, who treated his wife like an expensive appliance he had purchased to manage his household. I thought about the photos I had seen just hours earlier of my cousin Stephanie and her fiancé Mark. Mark had looked handsome, certainly, but his eyes were empty. He looked at Stephanie the way a man looks at a new luxury car. Pleased, proud, but ultimately detached. In my family, love was a transaction. It was an acquisition. It was something to be displayed in a glass case and guarded against the judgment of the country club. But this? What Oliver was feeling as Jasmine walked toward him. This was surrender. It was the complete, terrifying, glorious surrender of the ego. It was a vulnerability so raw and absolute that it felt almost intrusive to witness it. And yet, neither Jasmine nor Oliver cared who was watching. They weren't performing for the guests. They weren't performing for the cameras. They were entirely, singularly focused on each other. Jasmine reached him and Oliver immediately reached out, pulling her hands into his. He brought her knuckles to his lips, kissing them with a reverence that made several of the guests wipe their own eyes. I stepped back smoothly, giving them their space while keeping the shot fluid. Chloe was moving behind me, the rapid mechanical click of her shutter capturing the high-definition stills, but I knew the gold was currently resting in my camera roll. As the officiant, a close friend of theirs who spoke with a warm conversational cadence, began the ceremony, I retreated a few paces to the edge of the stone bridge. I lowered my gimbal and leaned against the cold, damp rock. I pulled up the video clip I had just taken. It was a perfectly framed 60 seconds. It started with Oliver's nervous anticipation, cut briefly to Jasmine walking through the mist with the acoustic guitar playing softly in the background, and ended with the raw, tearful adoration on Oliver's face when he finally saw her. I didn't mute the original audio. The roaring, chaotic power of Multnomah Falls layered beneath the delicate plucking of the guitar strings was too perfect, too metaphorical to erase. It was the sound of nature, of reality, overpowering the quiet, curated silence of traditional expectations. I opened the editing app and made no color corrections. I didn't smooth their skin or brighten the shadows. I left it exactly as it was, slightly moody, infinitely real. I typed out the caption with fingers that were numb from the cold mist, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. They tell you your wedding day is supposed to be a performance. They tell you it's about the flowers, the seating charts, the perfection of the aesthetic. But when you strip away the noise, when you walk away from the spectacle, you're left with the only thing that actually matters. This isn't a performance. This is a promise. I added the hashtag we had agreed upon, hashtag the unfiltered promise, and without second-guessing myself, I hit publish. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and returned my attention to the ceremony, Just as Jasmine and Oliver began reading their handwritten vows from small, crumpled pieces of paper, they laughed through their tears, stumbling over their words, their voices cracking with emotion. It was messy, beautiful, and profoundly imperfect. Standing there in the mist, listening to the roar of the waterfall and the quiet affirmations of true love, I felt the final lingering sting of my family's rejection wash away completely. They had excluded me because they thought I was too dramatic for their curated world. But looking at the genuine, heart-stopping reality unfolding in front of me, I realized that my family didn't exclude me because I was a liability to their perfection. They excluded me because I was a threat to their illusion. I pulled my phone back out to prepare for the kiss, catching a glimpse of my lock screen as the device woke up. A barrage of Instagram notifications had already begun to flood the screen. The likes were climbing by the dozens every second. Comments were pouring in. The digital ripple effect had begun. I smiled, raised my camera, and let the real world take over. The transition from the misty, roaring base of the waterfall to the historic Multnomah Falls Lodge was like stepping from a wild dream into a warm, firelit living room. The reception wasn't housed in a cavernous ballroom with uplighting and a sterile dance floor. Instead, they had taken over the lodge's dining room. A massive stone fireplace crackled at one end, casting a dancing, amber glow over long wooden farm tables. There were no rigid seating charts dictating who was important enough to sit near the bride. There were no towering floral centerpieces blocking everyone's view of each other. Just simple garlands of eucalyptus and loose wildflowers scattered among dozens of flickering taper candles. The atmosphere was entirely devoid of the anxious, performative energy that usually suffocates traditional wedding receptions. Jasmine had traded her veil for a comfortable pair of boots, and she and Oliver were simply mingling with their 20 guests, passing plates of roasted salmon and locally grown vegetables. It felt like the best dinner party you could ever hope to attend. I was hovering near the edge of the room, leaning against a sturdy oak pillar to steady my gimbal as I captured candid snippets of the dinner, when I realized my right thigh was practically numb. My phone, tucked into the front pocket of my trousers, had been vibrating with a relentless, frantic intensity for the better part of an hour. At first, I had ignored it, assuming it was just my mother or Aunt Helen firing off logistical updates or passive-aggressive observations in the muted family group chat. But the buzzing didn't stop. It felt like a nest of agitated bees against my leg. I lowered my camera, letting Chloe take the lead on capturing the toasts, and slipped into the quiet hallway near the coat check. I pulled my phone from my pocket. The screen lit up and my breath hitched in my throat. My lock screen was entirely obscured by a solid, cascading waterfall of Instagram notifications. They were moving so fast the text was blurring together. Likes, comments, shares, follows. I unlocked the phone and opened the app, my heart hammering a sudden, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The video I had posted of Oliver seeing Jasmine for the first time, the raw, unfiltered moment of his tears and her radiant smile, had caught fire. When I had slipped my phone away an hour ago, it had a few hundred views. Now the counter was spinning wildly. 50,000, 60,000, 75,000 views. The hashtag we had launched, hashtag the unfiltered promise, was trending regionally. But it wasn't the vanity metrics that made my hands shake. It was the comments. I scrolled through the rapidly updating feed, reading the words of complete strangers from all over the world. They weren't just leaving heart emojis or fire symbols. They were writing paragraphs. I'm supposed to get married in 3 months. One user wrote, "We are spending $60,000 and I've been having panic attacks every day about the seating chart and the linens. Watching this just made me break down sobbing. I'm showing this to my fiancé tonight. We are canceling the big party. This is all that matters." Another comment read, "I've been a wedding planner for 10 years and this is the most genuine groom reaction I've ever seen. The industry sells us an aesthetic, but you can't buy this kind of soul. Thank you for sharing the reality of love." Couples were tagging each other in the replies, leaving messages like, "This is how I want to look at you. And see? We don't need the country club." The spark I had felt in my Portland apartment had ignited into a roaring flame. I had tapped into a collective cultural exhaustion. People were tired of the glossy, unreachable perfection that social media had shoved down their throats for the last decade. They were starving for authenticity, and Jasmine and Oliver's quiet, tearful waterfall ceremony was a massive feast. My content wasn't just being consumed, it was moving people. It was making them reevaluate their own lives. Human nature is a powerful, petty thing, and standing there in the dim hallway, I couldn't resist the urge to look across the digital aisle. I tapped the search bar and typed in the hashtag my family had been aggressively pushing all week. Hashtag Stephanie and Mark Tanut. The grid that populated was a masterclass in everything my viral video was currently dismantling. The photos were undeniably high quality, likely shot by a photographer charging 3 times what Chloe did, but they felt entirely lifeless. I clicked on a video posted by my cousin Maya. It was a sweeping pan of the Napa Valley reception hall. There was an actual literal ice sculpture of a swan in the center of the room. The lighting was a cool, icy blue that made everyone look like they were attending a corporate gala. I found a clip of Stephanie and Mark's first dance. They were moving across a monogrammed dance floor, executing a clearly rehearsed, stiffly choreographed routine. Stephanie was smiling, but her eyes were fixed on the hem of her heavy gown, terrified of tripping. Mark was counting the beats under his breath. In the background I spotted my mother, standing near a towering floral arrangement, her arms crossed, her eyes darting around the room as if waiting for someone to spill a drink so she could spring into action and manage the crisis. I looked at the metrics on Stephanie's posts. The engagement was respectable for a private family event, maybe 300 or 400 likes on the main photos, but the comment sections were a digital wasteland. Beautiful dress, Steph. Stunning venue. Looks very expensive. Congratulations to the happy couple. It was an echo chamber of country club politeness. They were the kind of comments people leave because social decorum dictates it, not because they feel compelled by any genuine emotion. My family had spent a fortune to buy a billboard, and people were politely acknowledging the advertisement. The contrast was jarring and profoundly validating. My family had excluded me because they were terrified I would ruin their perfect image. They thought my tendency to speak the truth, my drama, was a liability. They wanted to curate an environment where reality couldn't intrude. But standing there watching the numbers climb on Jasmine's video, I realized the ultimate joke was on them. By trying to lock reality out, they had engineered an event that was entirely devoid of soul. Their content was just showing off, my content was changing minds. Hey, you okay? You've been staring at that screen like it holds the secrets of the universe. I looked up to see Chloe walking down the hallway, a plate of salmon in one hand and her camera dangling from a strap around her neck. Her cheeks were flushed from the warmth of the fire and the wine. Chloe, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I turned the screen around to face her. Look at this. Chloe squinted at the numbers, her eyes widening comically as her brain processed the view count and the endless stream of comments. Holy, Jen, is this real? That's my footage. That's your footage, their love, and an audience that is absolutely desperate for something real, I said, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across my face. It's going viral, Chloe. Not just wedding viral. Real viral. The internet is falling in love with them. Oh my God, she breathed, nearly dropping her plate. Do we tell them? I glanced back into the dining room. Jasmine and Oliver were sitting close together at the head of the farm table. Oliver was whispering something in Jasmine's ear, and she was laughing, leaning her head against his shoulder. They looked entirely oblivious to the fact that tens of thousands of strangers were currently weeping over their vows. No, I said softly, pocketing my phone. Not yet. Let them have their night. Let them just be in love. We can show them the metrics tomorrow. Tonight we just keep telling the truth. I grabbed my gimbal and walked back into the warmth of the lodge. The acoustic guitarist had started playing again, a slow, soulful melody that drifted beautifully over the clinking of silverware and the low hum of conversation. Jasmine and Oliver stood up from the table, not to make an announcement or clear the floor, but simply because they wanted to hold each other. They moved to a small, empty space near the fireplace and began to sway. No choreography, no counting beats, just a man and a woman resting their heads together in the firelight. I didn't check Stephanie's hashtag again. The phantom sting of the Napa Valley exclusion had entirely vanished, replaced by the warm, heavy weight of purpose. I raised my camera, hit record, and captured the spark turning into a wildfire. The transition from a dead, dreamless sleep to a state of full adrenaline usually takes a few minutes, but on Sunday morning, it happened the second my eyes opened. My Portland apartment was still cast in the soft, gray light of early dawn, but my nightstand was flashing like a strobe light. I sat up, the chill of the room hitting my bare shoulders, and reached for my phone. The device was almost hot to the touch. I squinted against the brightness of the screen and felt the air completely leave my lungs. It wasn't 50,000 views anymore. The video of Oliver seeing Jasmine at the waterfall had crossed the 500,000 mark sometime during the night, and it showed absolutely no signs of slowing down. My heart began a frantic, unsteady rhythm against my ribs as I opened Instagram. The notification tab was a solid wall of red. The hashtag the unfiltered promise was no longer just trending regionally. It had been picked up by 2 major wedding blogs and a national lifestyle account with 3 million followers. Complete strangers were stitching the video on TikTok, sobbing as they talked about how the wedding industry was a scam and how this raw, misty, and perfect waterfall elopement was the only way they ever wanted to get married. I scrolled through the comments, my thumb trembling slightly. I canceled my $80,000 country club wedding this morning because of this video. Look at his face. You can't fake that. The aesthetic doesn't matter when the love is that real. Why do we spend a year's salary to impress people we don't even like when we could just do this? I had intended to capture a beautiful moment for Chloe's portfolio, and perhaps prove a point to myself about the value of authenticity. I hadn't intended to start a movement. I dropped my phone onto the duvet and dragged my hands down my face, a breathless, slightly hysterical laugh escaping my lips. The drama my family was so terrified of me causing in Napa Valley was currently playing out on a global stage, and I hadn't even had to raise my voice. But the viral success of the video was only half the story lighting up my phone. The other half was a war zone. I opened my personal messages and voicemails. The muted family group chat had exploded from logistical updates about brunch buffets and airport shuttles into a frantic, chaotic mess of screenshots and passive-aggressive interrogations. My mother had left 3 voicemails. Aunt Helen had sent a barrage of texts demanding to know exactly where I was and what I was doing. I was staring at the wall, trying to process the sheer volume of the digital fallout, when the phone buzzed loudly in my hand. It was an incoming call from cousin Maya. Maya is the family's designated peacekeeper, the one who usually tries to smooth over the rough edges of my mother's condescension or Uncle Dave's bigotry. She's the one I had defended during her messy divorce, taking the heat from the family so she wouldn't have to. I answered, expecting her usual soft, conciliatory tone. "Jen," Maya said immediately, her voice sharp and brittle, completely devoid of its usual warmth. "What on earth are you doing?" I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my bare feet hitting the cold hardwood floor. "Good morning to you too, Maya. I'm currently drinking coffee and looking at some very impressive analytics. How was the Napa brunch?" "Don't play games with me," she snapped, the sudden aggression catching me off guard. "My entire feed is flooded with this waterfall wedding you shot. Aunt Helen is having an absolute meltdown in the hotel suite, and Stephanie has been locked in the bathroom crying for an hour." My stomach tightened, a sudden flare of defensive anger replacing the lingering shock of the viral numbers. Why is Stephanie crying? She just had her perfect magazine-ready wedding. She got exactly what she wanted, down to the eggshell linens. Because everyone is comparing her wedding to yours, Jennifer. Maya's voice cracked, sounding dangerously close to tears herself. "Half the family follows your public Instagram account. They saw the video last night. They saw the hashtag. And worse, their friends saw it. People are literally commenting on Stephanie's photos asking why her wedding feels so stiff, compared to the one you posted. They're asking why she spent so much money when she could have just had something real." The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. "Maya, I didn't tag Stephanie. I didn't mention Napa. I didn't say a single word about her wedding. I literally just posted a beautiful video of my friend's clients getting married. If people are looking at her perfectly curated 6-figure event and feeling like it's empty, that is a reflection of the event, not my video. It's the timing." Maya insisted, her voice rising an octave. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You couldn't handle being excluded, so you went out and manufactured this entire rival wedding just to spite her. You hijacked her weekend. It's incredibly vindictive, Jen." I stopped pacing. The cold from the floorboard seemed to seep all the way up into my bones. Manufactured. I repeated, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm. You think I somehow conjured a fully realized, deeply in love couple and a waterfall ceremony out of thin air just to ruin Stephanie's country club aesthetic? You work in social media. You know how to make things go viral. You engineered this because you wanted attention, Maya accused, though her conviction sounded slightly shaky. I realized then with a terrifying clarity that Maya wasn't just annoyed by the situation. She was threatened by it. The entire family was threatened by it. For my entire life they had controlled the narrative. They dictated what was acceptable, what was classy, and what was embarrassing. They had built their entire identity around the idea that their wealth and their curated image made them superior. By excluding me, they had attempted to silence the only person who refused to buy into the illusion. But I hadn't stayed silent. I had simply turned my lens toward something genuinely beautiful, something raw and honest, and the entire world had overwhelmingly declared that my version of reality was better than their expensive fiction. I hadn't manufactured a rival wedding. I had accidentally exposed the hollowness of theirs. I didn't engineer anything, Maya, I said softly, the anger draining away, replaced by a profound, heavy pity. I didn't have to. I just filmed two people who actually care more about each other than they do about what Aunt Helen thinks of their centerpieces. If that threatened Stephanie's perfect weekend, then maybe her perfect weekend wasn't built on a very solid foundation. You are so dramatic, Maya hissed, throwing the family's favorite weapon at me. You always have to make everything about you. No, I corrected her, feeling a strange, solid sense of peace settle over me. I actually made it entirely about Jasmine and Oliver. The internet is making it about them. The only people making this about Stephanie are the people who realize her aesthetic can't compete with actual genuine love. There was a long ringing silence on the line. I could hear Maya breathing heavily, trying to formulate a response that would put me back in the box they had so carefully constructed for me. But the box was gone. My mother is going to call you, Maya finally said, her voice tight and defeated. And Aunt Helen. They're furious, Jen. Let them be furious, I said, walking over to the window and looking out at the Portland skyline. The clouds were breaking, allowing thin shafts of pale sunlight to hit the pavement. I'm busy today. I have a lot of comments to respond to. I hung up the phone before she could say another word. I didn't wait for the inevitable barrage of guilt trips or the demands for apologies I had no intention of giving. I set the phone down on the windowsill and took a deep, steadying breath. The aftershocks were just beginning, and the epicenter was heading straight for me. But as I watched the view count on the video cross 600,000, I realized I wasn't afraid of the tremor anymore. I was exactly where I needed to be. The phone on my windowsill didn't stay silent for long. I had just poured myself a second cup of coffee and was watching the steam curl into the cool Portland air when the screen lit up again. The custom ringtone I had assigned to my mother, a sharp, classical string arrangement that always made me feel like I was late for an exam, pierced the quiet of my apartment. I watched the caller ID flash her name. For 27 years, that name on a screen had induced an immediate Pavlovian spike of anxiety. It meant I had done something wrong, said something inappropriate, or failed to live up to the rigid, unspoken metrics of the Anderson family brand. I picked up the phone. The glass was still warm from the barrage of notifications. I took a slow, deep breath, anchoring my feet to the hardwood floor, and swiped to answer. Jennifer. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask how my morning was. Her voice was trembling, but not with sadness. It was the tight, vibrating frequency of absolute panic wrapped in a thin layer of fury. I could hear the background noise of the Napa Valley Hotel suite, the frantic rustling of garment bags, the muffled, sharp voices of Aunt Helen and Uncle Dave, and the unmistakable sound of a heavy door slamming shut. It sounded like the command center of a political campaign that had just been hit with a devastating scandal. Good morning, Mom, I said, keeping my tone remarkably level. I took a sip of my coffee. It was a small physical reminder that I was in my own home, miles away from their chaos. Do not good morning me, she snapped, her breath hitching over the receiver. What have you done? Do you have any idea what is happening here? Stephanie is inconsolable. Helen is threatening to call the venue and demand a refund for the lighting. Our entire weekend has been hijacked by this. This malicious stunt you pulled. I haven't pulled a stunt, I replied calmly. I went to work. I documented a beautiful wedding for my best friend's photography business, and I posted the content. That's my job, Mom. I am a social media manager. You are a saboteur, she practically hissed. I could picture her pacing the plush carpet of her five-star suite, her silk blouse undoubtedly wrinkled from stress. You knew exactly what you were doing. You couldn't handle the fact that we asked you to sit this one out. We asked you for one weekend of peace, Jennifer. One weekend where you didn't have to be the center of attention, where you didn't have to cause a scene. And instead of acting like a mature adult, you decided to manufacture a global spectacle just to humiliate your cousin. I leaned against the kitchen counter, crossing my ankles. It was fascinating, really, to hear her spin the narrative. In her mind, the world revolved entirely around the Anderson family. The idea that a viral video could exist independently of their Napa Valley extravaganza was completely unfathomable to her. Mom, nobody is humiliating Stephanie, I said, trying to inject a sliver of logic into the hysteria. I haven't mentioned her. The internet doesn't even know she exists. They are just reacting to a beautiful, authentic moment between two people they've never met. That is a lie, my mother shouted, her voice breaking the polished veneer she spent her life maintaining. They do know she exists, Jennifer, because our friends follow you. Our extended family follows you. And now strangers are finding Stephanie's hashtag, because Maya idiotically engaged with one of your posts. Do you know what people are saying on Stephanie's photos right now? Do you have any idea how embarrassed she is? I remained silent, letting her spiraling energy burn itself out over the line. They are calling her wedding stiff, my mother choked out, the word sounding like physical poison on her tongue. Complete strangers are leaving comments under her first dance video, asking why she looks so miserable. They're comparing her floral arrangements to your stupid waterfall, and saying her wedding looks lifeless. They are asking why she spent $100,000 to look like a hostage. Someone actually commented that it looks like a corporate merger instead of a marriage. I closed my eyes. A tiny, involuntary wave of sympathy washed over me for Stephanie. No bride wants to hear that on the morning after her wedding. But that sympathy was quickly eclipsed by the glaring, unshakable truth of the situation. I didn't write those comments, Mom, I said softly. You invited them, she fired back. You posted that video of that unkempt man crying in the woods, and you wrote that pretentious caption about real love. You set the trap, Jennifer. You purposely posted something overly emotional so that Stephanie's elegant, restrained celebration would look cold by comparison. You upstaged her on the most important weekend of her life because you are bitter. And there it was. The ultimate accusation. I stood up straight, setting my coffee mug down on the counter with a definitive thud. For 27 years I had swallowed my words. When I was 10 and pointed out that Aunt Helen was being mean to a waitress, I was told to be quiet. When I was 20 and argued with Uncle Dave's politics, I was told I was ruining dinner. Whenever I held up a mirror to the family's toxic, shallow behavior, they didn't look at their reflection. They just attacked me for holding the glass. They called me too dramatic, because my emotions weren't convenient for their aesthetic. I realized in that exact moment that I had spent my entire life trying to translate my worth into a language they refused to speak. I was done translating. Mom, listen to me very carefully because I am only going to say this once. I began, my voice dropping an octave. It wasn't shaking. It wasn't hysterical. It was the steady, unyielding tone of a woman who had finally found the ground beneath her feet. I did not post that video to hurt Stephanie. I posted it because it was beautiful. If people are looking at her perfectly staged, six-figure wedding and calling it stiff and lifeless, that is not my fault. I didn't make them look stiff. Their obsession with perfection did. How dare you? She started, but I cut her off. No, you don't get to interrupt me this time, I said, the steel in my voice surprising even myself. You uninvited me from this wedding because you said I was a liability. You said I couldn't be trusted at a classy event because I might say something real. You wanted a sterile, perfectly controlled environment where everyone played their parts and no one went off script. Well, you got exactly what you wanted. You got your eggshell linens. You got your ice sculptures. You got your drama-free magazine spread. I took a breath, letting the silence hang between Portland and Napa Valley for a fraction of a second. But you forgot that people aren't stupid, I continued. They can tell the difference between a performance and a promise. I didn't engineer a crisis, Mom. I just showed the internet what actual unfiltered joy looks like. I didn't upstage Stephanie. I paused, letting the words crystallize in the air between us. The truth did. There was no immediate response. For the first time in my life, my mother was completely, utterly speechless. I could hear her breathing, jagged and shallow, but the frantic accusations had stopped. The script had been torn up, and she didn't know how to improvise. I spent my entire life trying to make myself small so that you wouldn't be embarrassed of me, I said, the remaining years of hurt finally bleeding out of my voice, leaving behind nothing but a clean, hollow ache. But I'm not embarrassed of myself anymore. I'm proud of the work I did yesterday. I'm proud of the story I told. If you and the rest of the family want to spend the rest of your lives curating a museum exhibit instead of actually living, that is your choice. But I am not participating in the exhibit anymore. Jennifer, she whispered, her voice sounding small, suddenly stripped of its country club armor. Have a safe flight home, Mom, I said. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button. The screen went dark. The call ended. I stood in the center of my kitchen, the silence of the apartment rushing back in to fill the space. I waited for the guilt to hit. I waited for the familiar, suffocating panic of knowing I had disappointed my mother. I waited for the urge to call her back, to apologize, to smooth things over and beg for her forgiveness just so I could be allowed back into the fold. It never came. Instead, a profound, almost dizzying lightness washed over me. It started in my chest and radiated out to my fingertips. My shoulders, which had been permanently braced near my ears for as long as I could remember, dropped an inch. The air in the room felt thinner, easier to breathe. I had carried the weight of their judgment, their labels, and their conditional love for 27 years. It had been a heavy, suffocating backpack filled with rocks labeled dramatic, difficult, and embarrassment. And with one push of a button, I had simply taken the backpack off and left it on the floor. I walked over to the window, the morning sun finally breaking fully through the Oregon clouds, casting long golden streaks across the hardwood floor. My phone buzzed on the counter. Another notification. Another stranger moved by the raw beauty of Jasmine and Oliver's love story. I smiled. The drama was finally over. And for the first time in my life, my story was just beginning. The silence in my apartment following the dial tone of my mother's call was absolute. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating quiet of a repressed argument. It was the clean, ringing stillness that follows a storm breaking. I stood by the window for a long time, watching the Portland traffic move sluggishly through the damp streets below, feeling as though I had just stepped off a treadmill I had been running on since childhood. I was breathing freely. I was untethered. And then the phone rang again. I glanced down at the screen resting on the windowsill. The name flashing across the glass made my newly discovered peace momentarily falter. Stephanie. The bride. The golden child. The undisputed epicenter of the weekend's Napa Valley earthquake. My immediate instinct was to let it go to voicemail. I had just fought the final boss in the form of my mother. I didn't have the emotional bandwidth to endure an onslaught from the princess of the realm. But as the phone continued its relentless vibration against the wood, a different impulse took over. I had spent my entire life being talked about, managed and hidden away. I was done avoiding the conversation. I picked up the phone, mentally donning my armor, fully expecting to be hit with a hurricane of bridal rage. I braced myself for the scream. I swiped the green button. Stephanie, listen. Jen. The word was a wet, ragged gasp. There was no scream. There was no barrage of insults or accusations about ruined aesthetics. There was only the unmistakable, devastating sound of a woman crying so hard she could barely draw breath. I froze, the defensive retort dying instantly in my throat. Stephanie never cried. Crying ruined the makeup. Crying caused puffiness. In the Anderson family, tears were considered a failure of emotional regulation, something to be hidden away or immediately wiped off with a silk handkerchief. But the sobbing coming through the receiver was ugly, guttural, and entirely unfiltered. It echoed slightly, as if she were hiding in a large, tiled space. Stephanie, I asked, my voice dropping its armor, replaced by a cautious, instinctual concern. Are you okay? Where are you? I'm on the floor of the bathroom in the bridal suite, she choked out, her breath hitching painfully. Mark is down at the golf course with his groomsmen. Aunt Helen is at the spa. I locked the door. Okay, I said softly, navigating this entirely foreign territory. The golden child was breaking down on the bathroom tiles, and I was the one she had called. Okay, just breathe. I know what Mom and Aunt Helen are saying. I know what the comments are saying online. Stephanie, I promise you I didn't post that video to hurt you. I didn't want to humiliate. Stop, she interrupted, her voice cracking. Stop defending yourself, Jen. I didn't call to yell at you. I didn't call to accuse you of anything. A long shaky exhale crackled over the line. I called because they're right. I blinked at the Portland skyline, entirely caught off guard. Who is right? The comments, she sobbed, the dam finally breaking completely. The strangers on the internet. Everyone who is looking at my photos and calling it stiff and cold and lifeless. They're right, Jen. It was. The whole day was just a giant, exhausting photo shoot. I sank down onto the edge of my sofa, the phone pressed tightly to my ear. The anger I had harbored toward her for months, for her complicity in my exclusion, for her flawless, untouchable pedestal, began to dissolve, replaced by a profound, heavy sadness. Talk to me, I urged gently. I woke up at 4 a.m, Stephanie began, her voice trembling as she recounted the day she had spent a year and a small fortune planning. The hair and makeup team arrived at 4:30. From that moment on, I wasn't a person. I was a prop. The magazine photographer kept yelling at me to tilt my chin, to suck in my stomach, to look candidly joyful toward the window. My dress was so heavy it left bruises on my ribs, but I wasn't allowed to sit down because it would wrinkle the silk. She paused to blow her nose, the decidedly unglamorous sound echoing in the massive hotel bathroom. When I walked down the aisle, she continued, her voice dropping to a hollow whisper, I didn't even see Mark at first. All I saw were the cameras. I saw Aunt Helen gesturing for me to slow down so the videographer could pan across my train. I saw the centerpieces, those massive stupid floral towers, blocking my view of my own father. And when I finally got to the altar, she broke off, a fresh wave of quiet tears choking her words. What happened at the altar, Steph? I don't remember, she confessed, the admission sounding like a confession to a terrible crime. I spent my entire wedding day worrying about the centerpieces and the magazine spread, and I don't remember the vows. I don't remember what Mark said. I was too busy staring at the officiant's lapel mic, wondering if it was picking up the rustle of my dress. I was worried the ice swan was melting unevenly in the reception hall. I stood there making the biggest promise of my life, and my mind was completely blank. I felt absolutely nothing. The silence stretched between us, heavy and tragic. She had bought the ultimate illusion, and when she unwrapped it, the box was empty. Then this morning I woke up, she said, her voice steadying slightly, tinged with a bitter irony. Mark was already out of bed, checking his emails. I picked up my phone to look at the photos people tagged me in. And right beneath my perfectly staged, heavily edited first dance video, was your post. My stomach tightened. Stephanie, I really am sorry about the timing. Don't be, she insisted fiercely. I watched the video, Jen. I sat in my $1,000 hotel bed, and I watched Oliver look at Jasmine. I saw his hands shaking. I saw her messy braid and the rain on her face. I watched it 10 times. And then I went into the bathroom, locked the door, and completely lost my mind. Because I realized I'm not mad at you for posting it. I'm not mad that it went viral or that it's upstaging my hashtag. She took a deep, shuddering breath. I'm jealous. I am so intensely, painfully jealous of that woman in the flannel shirt that I can barely breathe. The confession hung in the air, stripping away 27 years of carefully constructed family mythology. Stephanie, the untouchable, perfect daughter, was agonizingly jealous of the raw, messy reality that I had been banished for representing. Mark didn't look at me like that, she whispered, the heartbreak palpable. He looked at me like I was a very expensive trophy he had just won. He looked at me the way his partners look at a successful quarterly report. He didn't cry. He didn't even look nervous. And I didn't either. We just smiled for the cameras and hit our marks. For the first time in my life, I didn't see Stephanie as the golden child. I didn't see the woman who had everything I was denied. I saw a hostage in a gilded cage. Someone who had been conditioned since birth to believe that love was a performance, and that her worth was measured by how well she played the part. "Steph," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "you aren't a prop. And you didn't fail. You did exactly what this family trained you to do. They taught us that appearances are the only currency that matters. But you didn't buy it," she pointed out, a sad sort of admiration in her tone. "You always called them out. You always refused to play the game. They told me you were excluded because you were too dramatic. Because you would ruin the vibe. But sitting here on this floor, I realize they didn't exclude you because you were a threat to the wedding. They excluded you because you're the only one who would have looked at this circus and told me the truth, that I was miserable." Tears pricked my own eyes, hot and sudden. "I would have told you that you deserved to be looked at the way Oliver looks at Jasmine," I corrected her softly. "Because you do." "I'm so sorry, Jen," she cried, the apology rushing out of her like a physical weight being lifted. "I am so sorry I let them ban you. I was too weak to stand up to my mother. I was too focused on the aesthetic to realize I was cutting out the most authentic person in our family. I abandoned you for an ice swan and an eggshell napkin." I let out a wet, genuine laugh, wiping a tear from my own cheek. To be fair, I heard the napkins were very luxurious. Stephanie let out a watery giggle that quickly turned into a sigh of relief. And just like that, the walls came down. For the next hour, we didn't talk like the golden child and the black sheep. We talked like two women who had survived the same cult, comparing notes on the psychological warfare of our mothers. We talked about her fears regarding Mark, her exhaustion from pretending, and her deep secret desire to just wear sweatpants and be loved for her messiness. It was the first real conversation of our lives. When we finally hung up, the sun was fully shining over Portland. I looked at my phone, the screen now dark, and felt a profound shift in the universe. My family had tried to use this wedding to finally push me out of the narrative completely. But instead, the sheer, crushing weight of their perfection had shattered the illusion from the inside out. I hadn't just captured a viral video. I had accidentally handed my cousin the key to her own cage. By Monday morning, the digital wildfire had not simply continued to burn. It had consumed the entire landscape. When I walked through the glass doors of the boutique marketing firm in Portland's Pearl District, my phone was officially a brick of unmanageable notifications. The video of Jasmine and Oliver's waterfall ceremony had crossed 2 million views. The hashtag The Unfiltered Promise was the #1 trending topic on 3 different platforms. I was running on perhaps 4 hours of sleep, fueled entirely by a potent cocktail of cold brew coffee, and the lingering surreal adrenaline of Sunday's emotional revelations. The office was its usual Monday hum of lo-fi beats and the clacking of mechanical keyboards. Normally, I would slide into my cubicle, open my spreadsheets, and begin the tedious process of convincing mid-level lifestyle brands that they needed to sound more human in their captions. But today, the atmosphere felt distinctly different. As I hung my damp trench coat on the rack, I noticed several of my colleagues looking up from their monitors, exchanging glances that hovered somewhere between awe and intense curiosity. Before my computer had even finished booting up, the sleek, digital phone on my desk chimed. The caller ID glowed with a single name, Patricia. Patricia was the founder and CEO of the firm. She was a fiercely intelligent, terrifyingly observant woman who wore asymmetrical blazers, never raised her voice, and could dismantle a $1 million marketing strategy with a single raised eyebrow. She didn't do small talk, and she rarely summoned junior social media managers to her glass-walled corner office, unless someone had made a catastrophic error. I grabbed my notebook, took a steadying breath, and walked across the polished concrete floor. Through the glass, I could see her standing at her standing desk, her eyes fixed on a massive curved monitor. As I pushed the door open, she didn't look away from the screen. "Close the door, Jennifer, and have a seat," she said, her voice crisp and entirely unreadable. I shut the heavy glass door, sealing us inside the soundproof room, and sat in one of the leather guest chairs. When Patricia finally turned the monitor toward me, my heart gave a sudden hard thump. There, displayed in high definition, was the analytics dashboard for my personal Instagram account, alongside a complex web of social listening metrics tracking the hashtag The Unfiltered Promise hashtag. She had pulled the data. She was tracking the viral spread. "Explain this to me," Patricia said, leaning against the edge of her desk, crossing her arms. "And don't give me the humble, 'it was just a lucky moment' speech." I have watched this video 6 times. I have read the captions. I have analyzed the posting cadence. This wasn't an accident. This was a masterclass in counterprogramming. Talk to me. For a split second, the ghost of my mother's voice echoed in my head, warning me to minimize myself, to apologize for being too loud, too visible, too dramatic. But the woman sitting in this office wasn't the black sheep of the Anderson family anymore. She was the architect of a cultural moment. The wedding industry, and by extension, the lifestyle brands we represent, has spent the last decade selling an unattainable aesthetic. I began, my voice steadying as the professional strategist in me took the wheel. It's all about curation. It's about perfection. But perfection is alienating. People are economically stressed, burned out, and exhausted by the pressure to perform their lives for an audience. Patricia nodded slowly, her sharp eyes locked on mine. Go on. This weekend, I had a front row seat to the ultimate performative event, I continued, choosing not to mention that I was forcibly exiled from it. I saw what happens when you prioritize the aesthetic over the emotion. It leaves the audience and the participants feeling entirely empty. So when my friend Chloe asked me to help document this waterfall elopement, I knew exactly what not to do. I implemented what I called the anti-Napa strategy. No post shots. No filters. No pretending. I leaned entirely into the raw, the messy, and the profoundly vulnerable. I didn't sell a wedding. I documented a promise. And people responded because they are starving for reality. Patricia remained silent for a long, heavy moment. She looked at the monitor, at the staggering engagement rates and the thousands of paragraphs written by strangers pouring their hearts out in the comments section. Do you know what the hardest thing to manufacture in our industry is, Jennifer? She finally asked, walking around her desk to sit in her sleek ergonomic chair. Trust. Brands spend millions of dollars trying to convince consumers that they are authentic, and consumers see right through it because it's polished. It's written in a boardroom. What you captured this weekend wasn't written in a boardroom. It was bleeding raw humanity. You didn't just understand the algorithm. You understood the cultural zeitgeist. She opened a sleek, black folder on her desk and slid a piece of heavy stock paper across the glass surface toward me. I have been trying to convince our 3 biggest clients to pivot away from hyper-curated content for 6 months, Patricia said, her tone shifting from analytical to purely business. They have been resistant because they are terrified of looking unpolished. I am going to use your campaign from this weekend as the definitive case study to force their hands. But I need someone to lead the charge. I am officially creating a new division focused entirely on authentic brand storytelling, and I want you to run it. I stared at the paper. It was a revised contract. Creative Director of Narrative Strategy. The salary number printed at the bottom was nearly double what I was currently making. You want me to be a creative director? I asked, the words feeling foreign and impossibly heavy on my tongue. Based on a wedding video? I want you to be a creative director based on the instinct that produced that video, Patricia corrected her, her gaze piercing. You have a ruthless eye for the truth, Jennifer. In a world full of people trying to make things look pretty, you are willing to let things be real. That is a very rare, very valuable kind of bravery. I want that bravery leading my teams. A lump formed in my throat, thick and sudden. A ruthless eye for the truth. My family had spent my entire life penalizing me for that exact quality. They had called it a defect. They had branded me a liability. And here, in the cold, hard light of the corporate world, one of the most successful women I knew was looking at that very same trait and calling it a superpower. I accept, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, before clearing my throat and saying it again louder. I accept. Thank you, Patricia. I walked out of her office feeling as though the gravity in the building had fundamentally shifted. I was floating. I returned to my desk staring blindly at my computer screen, trying to process the fact that my life had completely transformed in the span of 72 hours. But the universe, it seemed, wasn't quite done with me yet. My cell phone buzzed. It was Chloe. Before you say anything, I am sitting down, I answered, a massive grin splitting my face. Because I just got promoted to creative director. Shut up. Oh my God, Jen, congratulations. Chloe shrieked, the sound forcing me to pull the phone away from my ear. That is incredible. But hold on to your chair because I have more news, and it is going to blow your actual mind. What is it? Did Jasmine and Oliver get a sponsorship deal for the lodge? Bigger, Chloe said, her voice dropping into a frantic, breathless whisper. I just got off the phone with the senior producer for Morning America, the actual national television show. They saw the hashtag. They saw the traction. They are putting together a 15-minute prime segment for next week. It's a deep dive into the changing culture of modern weddings. My jaw went slack. National television? Yes. But here is the kicker, Jen. Here is the absolute cherry on top of this insane Sunday. Chloe practically vibrated through the speaker. The segment is called Authenticity versus the Industry. They want to interview me, Jasmine, and Oliver about the waterfall wedding. And they want to interview you about the social media strategy that made it go viral. But they told me they are also looking for a counter-perspective. They want a bride who had a massive, traditional high society wedding this exact same weekend to talk about the pressure of the perfect aesthetic. The breath completely left my lungs. The irony was so potent, so perfectly poetic, that it felt like a physical blow. Did they mention who they were reaching out to? No, Chloe said, oblivious to the family drama unfolding behind the scenes. But they said they found some viral hashtags of luxury weddings in Napa, and they're making calls. I ended the call a few minutes later, staring blankly out the window of the marketing firm. The rain had started again, tapping a gentle rhythmic pattern against the glass. A profound, staggering realization washed over me, settling deep into my bones. My entire life, my mother, my aunts, and my uncles had looked at me and decided I was too dramatic. I had internalized that label. I had believed I was flawed, that my emotions were too big, that my refusal to ignore the elephant in the room was a character defect. I had spent 27 years trying to file down my edges so I wouldn't puncture their delicate, inflated balloon of a life. But as I looked at the contract sitting on my desk, and thought about the national television producer looking for the truth, I finally understood. I was never too dramatic. I was just too real. My family lived in a beautifully curated, oxygen-deprived bubble. They survived on the currency of appearances, terrified of any crack that might let the messy, unpredictable reality of human emotion seep in. My presence, my honesty, my demand for authentic connection, was a needle hovering dangerously close to their fragile illusion. By excluding me from Stephanie's wedding, they hadn't banished a troublemaker. They had simply insulated their dollhouse. And in doing so, they had set me free. They had pushed me out into the real world. A world that didn't want eggshell linens or fake smiles. The real world was starving for the exact thing I had to offer. The weight I had carried for nearly 3 decades evaporated into the damp Portland air. I wasn't the black sheep anymore. I was the one who had finally escaped the pen. 6 months is both a blink of an eye and an eternity. It is exactly enough time for the leaves to change, for a viral internet sensation to settle into a permanent cultural shift, and as it turns out, for a family to completely dismantle and rebuild its entire foundation. The air in Stephanie and Daniel's backyard tasted of wood smoke, turning autumn leaves and cheap, delicious grocery store wine. There were no sweeping, manicured vineyard vistas. There were no towering monoliths of imported orchids, no ice swans slowly melting under the glare of blue corporate lighting, and absolutely no eggshell linens. Instead, there were mismatched wooden folding chairs borrowed from neighbors, thick wool blankets draped over the backs of them to ward off the October chill, and zigzagging rows of warm, amber string lights suspended between 2 ancient oak trees. It was messy. It was entirely uncurated. And it was the most beautiful space I had ever stood in. I was leaning against the wooden railing of their back deck, a professional-grade DSLR camera resting comfortably in my hands. But my smartphone, the device that had essentially launched my career into the stratosphere and shattered the Anderson family's glass house 6 months ago, was buried deep in my tote bag inside the house, switched firmly to airplane mode. There would be no hashtags tonight. There would be no live streams, no analytics dashboards, and no viral strategies. The footage I was capturing tonight wasn't for the millions of strangers who had followed our story since the television segment aired. It was for a small, wooden USB drive that would sit on Stephanie's coffee table. It was just for her. The journey to this backyard had been anything but easy. The fallout from the Napa Valley wedding had almost destroyed Stephanie and Daniel's relationship before it even had a chance to begin. Stripped of the wedding planning, the magazine interviews, and the endless pursuit of the perfect aesthetic, they had returned from their honeymoon and realized they were essentially two strangers sharing a very expensive mortgage. The pressure of the performance had eclipsed the actual partnership. They had separated for a month, spending weeks in intensive therapy, learning how to actually look at each other without an audience present. They had to tear the entire house down to the studs to see if the foundation could hold. It did. But they realized that the vows they had spoken in California hadn't belonged to them. They had belonged to the event. They needed a reset. They needed to do it right. I lifted the camera as the back door swung open and Aunt Helen stepped out onto the patio, carrying a massive, slightly lopsided tray of homemade lasagna. 6 months ago, Aunt Helen would have rather walked across hot coals than serve a buffet-style meal on paper plates. She had lost 10 pounds from the stress of the Napa wedding, and had spent the entire weekend barking orders through clenched teeth. Tonight, she was wearing a comfortable, oversized cashmere sweater, her hair pulled back into a messy clip. She set the tray down on a picnic table, laughed loudly at a joke Uncle Dave made, and wiped a smudge of tomato sauce off her cheek without a mirror. The frantic, brittle energy that used to define her was completely gone. My mother was standing a few feet away, pouring wine into a plastic cup for my cousin Maya. The change in my mother was perhaps the most profound of all. Following our explosive phone call, and her subsequent horror at realizing the entire world was applauding the very daughter she had tried to hide, she had finally agreed to go to therapy. It had been a brutal, tear-filled process of unpacking her own generational trauma, confronting the terrifying reality that she had prioritized the appearance of a perfect family over the actual well-being of her children. We still had our moments of friction, but the condescension was gone. She looked over at me, caught me filming her, and instead of straightening her posture and fixing her hair, she just offered me a warm, crinkling smile and raised her plastic cup in a silent toast. Then the back door opened again, and the low hum of conversation in the yard organically faded into a reverent, breathless hush. Stephanie walked out onto the grass. She wasn't wearing a custom silk gown that bruised her ribs. She was wearing a simple, flowing ivory slip dress she had bought off the rack, paired with a worn-in denim jacket to fight the autumn air. Her feet were completely bare, her toes sinking into the cool grass. Her hair was loose, blowing gently in the wind, and her face was devoid of the heavy, professional makeup that had masked her features 6 months ago. She looked vibrant. She looked awake. Daniel was waiting for her under the oak trees. He was wearing dark chinos and a white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. When Stephanie walked toward him, I brought the camera up to my eye, framing his face. I held my breath, waiting for the echo of that empty, detached stare I had seen in the Napa Valley footage. It never came. As Daniel looked at his wife, his eyes softened completely. The tight, corporate set of his jaw vanished, replaced by a look of such overwhelming, vulnerable relief that my own eyes pricked with tears. He didn't look like a man acquiring a trophy. He looked like a man who had almost lost the best thing that had ever happened to him, and was finally being given a second chance to hold on to it. He looked at her the exact same way Oliver had looked at Jasmine at the waterfall. There was no officiant this time. There was no lapel mic to pick up the rustle of fabric. There were just 20 people standing in a loose circle on the lawn, holding their breath as Stephanie and Daniel took each other's hands. 6 months ago, I made promises to you that I didn't fully understand, Daniel began, his voice rough and completely unamplified, forcing all of us to lean in closely to hear him. I was so focused on being the perfect groom that I forgot how to just be your partner. I forgot that this isn't a show. It's a life. And I almost lost you because I was too busy looking at the cameras instead of looking at you. Stephanie let out a watery, beautiful laugh, a tear spilling over her lashes and tracking freely down her cheek. She didn't reach for a tissue. She just let it fall. I wanted a magazine cover, Stephanie whispered back, her voice shaking with raw emotion. I wanted everyone to look at us and think we had it all figured out. But I realized that I don't want to be envied anymore, Daniel. I just want to be known. I want the messy, the imperfect, and the real. I want the arguments in the kitchen and the burnt dinners and the quiet mornings. I don't want a perfect wedding anymore. I just want a real marriage. I kept the camera steady, the mechanical click of the shutter the only sound cutting through the quiet sniffles of our family. I zoomed in on their hands tightly intertwined, knuckles white with the desperate, beautiful group of people who finally understood the assignment. They didn't bother with rings this time, they already had them. They just pulled each other into a fiercely tight embrace, burying their faces in each other's necks, hiding from the world in the safety of their own arms. The yard erupted into cheers and applause. It wasn't polite golf clap applause. It was loud, raucous, and deeply joyous. Uncle Dave let out a piercing whistle. Aunt Helen was openly weeping into a paper napkin. I lowered the camera, wiping my own face, feeling a profound, heavy weight permanently lift from the center of my chest. Later, after the lasagna had been devoured and the wine bottles were mostly empty, we gathered around a small fire pit Daniel had built on the patio. The orange embers cast a warm, dancing light across the faces of the people I had spent my entire life trying to appease. I was sitting on a cooler, scrolling through the footage on my camera's small LCD screen, when Stephanie stood up and tapped a plastic fork against her wine glass. The chatter died down. Stephanie looked around the fire, her eyes shining in the firelight, before her gaze finally landed on me. "I want to make a toast," she said, her voice steady and clear. "To my cousin, Jennifer." A few heads turned my way. My mother smiled, reaching out to give my knee a gentle squeeze. "For 27 years this family had a favorite word," Stephanie continued, stepping closer to the fire. "We called Jennifer dramatic. We used it as an insult. We used it to silence her when she pointed out things we didn't want to look at. We used it as an excuse to exclude her from my wedding in Napa, because we were terrified that her tendency to feel things deeply and speak about them honestly would ruin our perfect, plastic aesthetic." She looked down at her bare feet, taking a deep breath before meeting my eyes again. "But over the last 6 months I've had to do a lot of unlearning," Stephanie said, her voice thick with emotion. "I learned that what we were calling drama was actually just passion. It was authenticity. It was the bravery to care enough about the truth to say it out loud, even when it made the rest of us uncomfortable. Jennifer, you were the only one in this entire family who wasn't pretending. You were the only one who knew that love shouldn't look like a corporate merger." She raised her plastic cup, her hand trembling slightly. "You didn't cause a scene, Jen. You saved my life. You saved my marriage. You forced all of us to look in the mirror and realize that the aesthetic we were killing ourselves to maintain was completely empty. You brought the truth back into this family. And for the first time in my life, I can honestly say that I am so incredibly grateful for your drama." The entire family raised their mismatched cups, glasses, and beer bottles toward me in the firelight. "To Jennifer," they echoed, the chorus of voices rising up into the cold autumn night. I stood up, my throat entirely closed with tears, and walked around the fire pit to pull my cousin into a crushing hug. The smell of wood smoke clung to her denim jacket, and as she squeezed me back, I realized something fundamental had shifted. The family hadn't just tolerated me tonight. They hadn't just allowed me back into the fold on their terms. They had completely rewritten the rules of the house. I was no longer the black sheep, the liability, or the embarrassment they needed to manage. I was the heartbeat they had finally learned how to listen to. And as I looked over Stephanie's shoulder at the chaotic, uncurated, beautifully messy reality of my family laughing around the fire, I knew I would never have to make myself small for them ever again. The hum of a crowd of 3,000 people sounds entirely different from the polite, golf clap silence of a country club. It is a living, breathing entity, a collective vibration of anticipation that practically hums against your skin. I stood in the wings of the main stage at the San Diego Convention Center, listening to that low electric murmur. The backstage area was a flurry of activity. Producers with headsets darting back and forth, audio technicians checking mic packs, and the booming voice of the conference MC echoing through the massive auditorium. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored emerald green blazer, took a deep breath of the cool, air-conditioned air, and let the sheer magnitude of the moment wash over me. "Ladies and gentlemen," the MC's voice thundered, vibrating through the floorboards beneath my boots. "Please welcome our morning keynote speaker, the creative director of narrative strategy, Jennifer Anderson." The applause rolled through the cavernous room like a wave as I stepped out from behind the heavy black velvet curtains and walked to the center of the brightly lit stage. The spotlights were blinding, momentarily washing out the faces in the audience, rendering the thousands of marketing executives, brand strategists, and content creators as nothing more than a sea of silhouettes. But as my eyes adjusted to the glare, The front row came into sharp, brilliant focus. My breath caught in my throat, just for a fraction of a second, before a profound, unbreakable smile spread across my face. They were all there. My mother sat dead center, wearing a bright, unapologetic yellow blouse, a color she would have deemed far too loud just 18 months ago. She wasn't sitting with the rigid, perfectly aligned posture she used to adopt in public spaces. She was leaning forward, her hands clasped in her lap, looking up at me with an expression of such fierce, unfiltered pride that it practically radiated off her. To her left sat Stephanie and Daniel, their shoulders pressed comfortably together, Daniel casually resting his arm along the back of her chair. To her right was Aunt Helen, fumbling with her smartphone, clearly trying to take a blurry, completely uncurated photo of me on the stage without caring at all about the lighting or the angles. Maya and Uncle Dave were there too. They weren't sitting in the front row as my guards, my managers, or my critics. They weren't there to make sure I didn't embarrass the family brand. They were there as my audience. They were there as my champions. I reached out and lightly gripped the edges of the sleek wooden podium. 18 months ago, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the state-of-the-art sound system, echoing into the farthest corners of the room. I was standing in my small kitchen in Portland, Oregon, being told by my mother that I was uninvited from a major family wedding. A ripple of surprised, nervous laughter moved through the audience. In the front row, my mother didn't flinch. She just smiled a little wider, nodding at me to keep going. The reason I was given was simple, I continued, pacing slowly across the stage, the click of my boots rhythmic and grounded. I was told that I was too dramatic. The wedding in question was a six-figure destination event in Napa Valley. It was designed for a magazine spread. It was curated down to the exact Pantone shade of the dinner napkins. And my family, who I love very much, and who are sitting right here in the front row today, believe that my tendency to speak the truth, to call out hypocrisy, and to demand authentic connection would somehow ruin the aesthetic. I was a liability to their illusion of perfection. So they cut me out of the picture entirely. I paused, looking out at the thousands of professionals sitting with their notebooks and laptops open. I tell you this not to air my family's dirty laundry, because as you can see, we've done a lot of laundry together since then. I tell you this because what happened that weekend is the exact same crisis currently facing the marketing and advertising industry today. The room fell dead silent. 3,000 people leaned in. That same weekend, while my family was executing a flawless, emotionally sterile performance in California, I decided to help a friend shoot a completely different kind of wedding, I explained. It was an elopement at Multnomah Falls. The budget was practically non-existent. The bride wore a flannel shirt while she got ready. The groom cried so hard he could barely speak his vows. It was messy. The weather was damp. The lighting was entirely out of our control. But when I posted a 60-second video of that raw, unpolished, profoundly vulnerable moment online, it didn't just go viral. It started a cultural conversation. I clicked the remote in my hand, and the massive screens behind me lit up with the analytics dashboard from that weekend, followed by a montage of the thousands of comments we had received. We work in an industry that has spent decades building glass houses, I said, my voice rising with passionate conviction. We sell perfection. We sell the Napa Valley aesthetic. We spend millions of dollars trying to convince consumers that if they just buy the right product, use the right filter and curate the right image, their lives will be flawless. But the consumer, just like a human heart, is starving. They are exhausted by the pressure to perform. When they look at your perfectly polished corporate campaigns, they feel the exact same way my cousin Stephanie felt on her wedding day. Completely detached, alienated, and alone. I walked back to the center of the stage, locking eyes with Stephanie. She was crying, but she was nodding, a beautiful makeup-free smile breaking through her tears. Authenticity isn't a buzzword, I told the crowd. It is a survival strategy. You cannot manufacture genuine connection in a boardroom. You cannot buy soul. If you want people to care about your brand, your story, or your art, you have to be brave enough to let them see the mess. You have to be willing to drop the heavy, suffocating armor of perfection. Because perfection doesn't move people. Truth does. I spent the next 40 minutes walking them through the specific strategies my team now uses to build narrative campaigns. I talked about the metrics of vulnerability, the ROI of honesty, and the absolute necessity of treating audiences like intelligent, feeling human beings rather than algorithms to be manipulated. The audience was enraptured. I saw executives from Fortune 500 companies furiously scribbling notes. I saw seasoned advertising directors nodding in profound agreement. I was commanding the room not by projecting an image of an untouchable corporate titan, but by standing there as exactly who I was, a woman who had once been cast out for feeling too much. As my time on the timer began to wind down, I clicked to my final slide. It was a simple, stark white screen with black text. It was a photo Chloe had taken of me on the patio during Stephanie and Daniel's backyard recommitment ceremony, laughing so hard my head was thrown back, completely unguarded. I spent 27 years of my life believing that my deepest instincts were character flaws. I said, my voice softening, filling the massive room with a quiet, intimate resonance. I believed that being too dramatic meant I was broken. When my family excluded me, I felt a devastation that I thought would break me. But standing here today, looking out at all of you, and looking down at the people I love most in this world, I realized something fundamental about the nature of being pushed out. I stepped away from the podium entirely, walking right up to the edge of the stage, closing the distance between myself and the front row. Rejection is very rarely the end of your story, I said, my eyes finding my mother's. Most of the time, rejection is just a detour to your true purpose. The universe will systematically strip away the rooms where you do not belong. It will force you out of the glass houses and the curated bubbles that require you to shrink yourself. It hurts. It is terrifying. But it happens because you are meant to find a stage where you don't have to whisper. A heavy, beautiful silence wrapped around the auditorium. Do not apologize for your edges, I concluded, my voice ringing with a fierce, joyful clarity. Do not let anyone convince you that your demand for the truth is a liability. The world does not need another perfect, quiet performance. The world needs exactly who you are, in all your messy, unfiltered glory. Thank you. For a split second, the room remained completely still, and then the front row moved. My mother was the first one on her feet. She stood up, tears streaming freely down her face, and began to clap with a fierce, unyielding pride. Stephanie and Daniel were up next, followed by Aunt Helen and Uncle Dave. And then, like a tidal wave crashing through the convention center, 3,000 professionals rose from their seats. The sound of the standing ovation was deafening, a roaring thunder of applause that shook the floorboards and echoed up into the high ceilings. I stood at the edge of the stage, bathing in the bright lights, the overwhelming noise, and the undeniable reality of my own life. I looked down at my family, the people who had once tried to edit me out of their picture, now giving me a standing ovation for refusing to change. I didn't try to hold back my tears. I didn't try to compose my face into a mask of professional stoicism. I just smiled, let the tears fall, and mouthed the words thank you to my mother. She pressed her hand to her heart and mouthed I love you right back. The black sheep was gone. The golden child was gone. The labels, the boxes, the quiet resentments and the heavy, expensive illusions had all burned to the ground. We were just people now. Flawed, beautiful, incredibly real people. And as the applause continued to echo through the hall, I knew with absolute certainty that this was the greatest story I would ever get to tell. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying with me until the very end of this journey. I am truly humbled that you chose to spend your valuable time listening to this story today. If there is one thing I hope you take away from this, it's that sometimes the rejection that breaks our hearts is actually life's way of making room for our true purpose. Never be afraid to be your authentic self, even when it feels like you don't fit into the boxes others have made for you. Your honesty, your passion, and your voice are your greatest strengths. I would absolutely love to hear from you. Have you ever felt excluded or misunderstood just for being yourself? How did you find the courage to walk your own path? Please, share your experiences in the comments below. Your story matters, and your words might be exactly the inspiration someone else needs to read today. If this story touched your heart, or if you found a piece of yourself in these words, please consider subscribing to Mother's Story. Let's continue to build a beautiful community where every genuine, unfiltered voice is heard and celebrated. Until next time, stay true to who you are. Thank you so much for being here.